Coach Robb podcast, answering questions and eliminating frustrations about health, wellness, and performance since 1987.
Welcome to the Coach Robb Performance Podcast number 8. Coach Robb, how are we doing on this fine Friday afternoon?
Good afternoon, my man. It's always good to see you. I can't thank you enough. I know I say at the beginning of every show, but I know how extremely busy you are. For anybody who doesn't know you, as I say, you're busier than a one-arm paper hanger. So thank you so much for making these a priority. And I do appreciate your time sincerely.
Yes, sir. You're looking fine today, sir. You got yourself a tan right there. Looks like maybe you've been laying out on the beach with a drink in your hand or something.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who know me, I love the beach. And as I talk about here on these podcasts, and I encourage all of our listeners, try to attach some kind of a reward for any, significant achievements. And we are actually at this point, our corporate wellness program, our vertical of business is complete. And so Michaela and I were fortunate enough, we were able to get out of town, headed down to Costa Rica, and got away from everything interesting enough when you get down there. For the most part, there's we stay up at an Airbnb up on top of a mountain. Doesn't have the best bandwidth, which works out perfect because then I put away the computer, put away the phone. We check in with our kids each day, and other than that, we get off the grid for a while. But no, thank you very much. It feels good to be back, and it was a reward for getting out and getting that business vertical done. And then my oasis is the beach, and so whenever I get a chance, that's become a special place for Michaela and I. This was our second time going there, so we've got a good rapport with the local community, and the gentleman that we rent the Airbnb from, super nice. So it's good to be back. I'll tell you what.
Well, I'll let you stop rubbing it in because I'm getting a little jealous. But I want to thank all of our listeners, all of our viewers on YouTube. If you guys are watching, make sure you guys like and subscribe. It definitely helps us out. Make sure you share with your friends. Then don't be afraid to leave a comment or anything down in the comment section below. We'd love to hear your questions, comments, criticism, whatever you got. Leave it because we love it.
Absolutely. And it's
Coach
funny you
Robb.
say that, Dan, because that's not to interrupt you, excuse me, but it's interesting that you do say that because since our last podcast, I've had a lot of questions about the subject that we're going to be talking about tonight. So you bring up a really good point. We do take those comments, we do take the messages seriously. We do take the emails seriously that come in. So, yes, please, first and foremost, thank you for watching and listening. But please do what Dan said because we use that as something to kind of guide our ship and our rudder. I have a lot of concepts that I've got written down that, hey, if we don't have questions coming in from listeners, then sure, well, you and I will talk about it. But as we say, this is the people's podcast, and that's exactly what we're dealing with tonight. Was a lot of questions that came in. Hey, what's going on? And can you help me clarify it? So I'll let
Yeah.
you intro it formally so people have a better idea of what we're talking about tonight.
It's cool because I was at the track last week and I actually had a gentleman that listens to the show
Okay.
and came up and said, "Hey, man, I really enjoy your guys' topics. You talk about things that others don't
Mm,
and really break it down basic, right? Because all this is pretty basic. We know we need to eat, we know we need to sleep, that
sure.
type of thing. But he's like, you guys talk about it and you're motivating. You were motivating to me to try to, to redirect my program and get myself back on track. And it's like, man, I really appreciate you guys. So I love that. That's what is so rewarding to me, especially when somebody face to face tells you that they enjoy what we're doing and
Absolutely.
the topics that the listeners, like you said, they essentially come up with, right? They're
Yep,
telling us what they
absolutely.
want and we listen. So
Well, on the subject of Michaela and I flying to Costa Rica, we get on an airplane and in this, you're getting on a plane. I don't care how much you fly. There's always that little bit of you don't want to make eye contact with anybody. And I was walking down the aisle and this guy goes, "Are you Coach Robb?" And I was like, I don't know if that's a good question or a bad question. Is somebody going to tell me I'm full of shit and I need to go jump off a cliff, or are they going to embrace what we have to say? Or if somebody disagrees, I have no problem with that as long as there's going to be an adult banter associated with it. But I always tease Michaela when that happens. I'm always a little trepidatious to go, do I say yes or do I say, I know of them? It's my twin brother, it's my other brother, Larry, my other brother Daryl, for those that are my age and understand that joke. But yeah, I do agree. When you get that face to face, and it does take a lot of time and effort for us to put these shows together. And when you do get a chance to talk to somebody face to face, tangibly, that says, "Hey, that really resonated with me," or finally clicked, as we always say, getting the pieces of the puzzle to come together. I do agree with you. It's a great feeling. So
Yep.
glad they said
Well,
something to you.
let's get into it. Today's show topic is, why am I falling off the pace? And
Yeah.
it's not always about fitness. And I've been down that road, Coach.
Yeah.
I have, where I get to the track and I'm just not feeling good. I'm slower than normal. Just not, can't get in the groove. But I think that I'm doing all the right things and working out and everything and going to the gym, and not my fitness, it's other
Yeah.
things. So
It's interesting you introduced it the way you did, because I don't think it doesn't matter what athlete we work with. Most people know we have four verticals of business. We have an endurance division, we have a general fitness and weight loss, we have a ball and stick, which is agility, and then we have our motorsports division. There's not one person that we work with that may be at the very best of the sport that they're in that wouldn't say that they could be in a little bit better shape. And I think that's important for the listeners to understand, because even if you're 30 pounds overweight, somebody who's not 30 pounds overweight still thinks that they can be in better shape. So I don't want to dismiss the idea that, sure, some of us might and could be in better shape than we are, and we're working on it. But what we want to talk about this evening is the frustration of what you just articulated. You've been putting in the time. By the way, Dan, great job. You've put a lot of time and effort into getting to the gym. You've been consistent. I love when you hit me up and say, "Hey, man, fourth consecutive week, only one day of rest, as you suggest, and you're nailing it. You feel good. You're sleeping good. All systems say go."
hey, I even, just real quick,
Yeah.
sorry to cut you off. I
No, you're not.
even finally, because you're a Garmin guy. You've been a
Yep.
Garmin guy, and I've been a Polar guy, just because that's what I've had in the past. I finally stepped out of my comfort zone and I got myself a Garmin watch.
Hmm.
So
And I'm glad to hear you say that, because when you go and you start looking at the minute details of information that comes back, it's going to fit right in line with what we're going to talk about tonight. Sure, sometimes it could be fitness. And again, I'm going to reiterate, all of us will, no matter how in shape you are, no matter how low your percentage of body fat is, you're always going to have somebody who says, "Oh, I could be a little bit better shape." So let's just kind of agree that we all could be in a little bit better shape. But the irony of it, Dan, when you mentioned, "Hey, I'm out there riding, I'm trying to be consistent on my lap times." And one of two things are happening. Either I'm inconsistent in my lap times. And for those of you who may not understand what we mean by lap times, Dan's primary sport of choice is motocross. Well, you may be a triathlete. You could be applying this to speed work on the track. You could be a cyclist. What are the times on your 5 mile interval blocks? Each sport's a little bit different. What we're talking about is the inconsistencies of performance. That's when we say, when you're out there on the track, let's just use 2 minutes as a lap time. One time you come around, you're two, the next one you're 2:03, then you're 2:01, then you're at 1:58, then you're at 2:07. Now, again, we're making assumptions like you're not pushing the front end, you're not dabbing your foot. I'm talking about your energy levels are just all over the place. This is why we titled today's webinar and this entire conversation around, why am I falling off the pace? It could be inconsistencies, or it could just be literally you're throwing anchor. Dan, you've had those motos where somebody gets a better start than you. They're 3, 4 seconds ahead of you, and all of a sudden it's like somebody grabbed their e-brake and you just go by them like they're tied to a pole. Well, as you know, they've thrown anchor, right? They're loaded up with lactic acid. They can't catch their breath. Their legs are on fire, whatever combination of those three, and you just march right by them. Well, let me ask you this. If we take that exact scenario, you're out there, you catch somebody and you go by them. So let's say, and I know it's a lot of numbers, but just hang in there with me. Let's say, Dan, the gate drops. You're running a 2 minute lap time and somebody in front of you goes out at a 1:58. They put 2 seconds on you in the first lap. The second lap, they slow down to a 2 minute. You still run a 2 minute lap time. They're still sitting 2 minutes and 2 seconds in front of you. Well, then on that third lap, they drop to a 2:04. You're running a 2 minute. You're now up by 2 seconds. You see the math about again, I'm not trying to insult anyone's math skills, But when we get into certain sports where, and I'll go back to your sport, Dan, because you enjoy it so much. When we look at something like motocross, if you can treat it like a 5K, if you went out and you ran a 5K and I go, Dan, how'd your 5K go? Oh, went great. I ran at 18:30. I didn't ask you what your pace was per mile because you could tell me I went out at 5 minutes, blew up, and ended up running 2 6-minute miles, right?
Yep.
Or whatever the math equates to. All you told me is finish time and how I finished overall in my age group or overall in the race, whichever is important to you. Do you see how we have a tendency to kind of disassociate things? When we're talking about tonight's conversation about falling off the pace, we want to avoid two things: inconsistencies and throwing that dreaded dead anchor where you're feeling good and then all of a sudden it's like somebody just grabs the e-brake and then like I said earlier, you're holding the pace and everybody else is slowing down so much that, again, not insulting anyone's math. If you slow down by 1 second and I speed up by 1 second, I pass you with a net gain of 2. Well, how demoralizing is that when let's flip the role. You go by me. I'm at my red line. I went out way too fast. I've smoked myself. We still have 3 laps to go, and you just go right by me. So what do? I'm competitive, as all of our listeners are. They chase. You've got nothing left in the tank. You're already sitting at maximum effort. Well, then all of a sudden you go, gosh, Dan just dropped me like a bad idea. Let's come back to your original comment, Dan.
Well, and
Is
that's
that
not even the worst part of it.
Yeah.
When you're in that position,
Yep.
you're smoked, you're weak, you're tired, and that's when you're going to make the big one and injure yourself, right?
You're going to yard dart yourself.
How many times have we seen it? You're just right over your head,
Yep.
but you don't have the energy, the strength to ride that pace, and you end up getting hurt.
That's exactly it. And then if we zoom out to the 10,000 foot level for those that are hyper competitive, what does that do for your confidence? So now we've just created an absolute quagmire of mistakes, and a lot more than just, healing up from hitting the ground. Now you kind of feel demoralized. Now you got to try to build that back, and your competition just got a leg up on you because you keep spending half the year injured because you keep making the same habitual mistake. Let me share, Dan, if it's okay with you, let me
Yes.
share. I want to share one screen real quick. And it's something that our listeners, and if you're listening to us in a podcast format, I would encourage you to go to YouTube so you can get a couple visuals of these illustrations that we're talking about. I want you to look at this screen here. And Dan, you and I have talked about what is stress? Where does stress come from? And I've said to you, it always comes from one of 4 areas. Every single minute of our life, you're thinking about personal, professional, dealing with financial, or in the relationship that we all have here together, the athletic side of things. On the right side of the equation, we always say, with the exact same size of the box, you have to eat and sleep enough, and you have to get enough quality of both to help you sufficiently balance the entire category of stress. When you do that, life is good. Well, let's take this illustration a step further. Dan, you've been very dedicated to your fitness this year. You've been really dedicated to being consistently getting to the track and riding. So if I can get, for those of you that are watching this on YouTube, if I want to add 1% to this box on the left, I want to be a little leaner, a little faster, a little wealthier. I want to have a better relationship with Michaela. I want to enjoy my job. And whether you're an employer or an employee, I want to enjoy my job, right? It's a necessary evil for some of us. The mistake that we make, Dan, is we increase the size of the stress box on the left, but we inadvertently forget that we have to increase the size of the box on the right-hand side. Now, if I can get everybody who's watching this on YouTube to kind of sear this image in your mind, and let's toggle over to yet a different illustration, but one that's going to help complement exactly what we're talking about. And this is putting our frustration in the wrong place. This is very, very important because, Dan, what we just spent 20 minutes talking about is most people, and by the way, when you're looking at this illustration, please read it literally from left to right, because this is the order that you have to look at how you perform in training, racing, cross training, and your sport of choice. So, for example, we just spent 20 minutes talking about the idea that a lot of people have a bad day at the races, and the first thing they want to do is contribute it. Oh, I got to get in shape. I got to get in better shape. Now, as you can see on the screen here, You may say to me, I need to work on my opening sprint speed. I need to work on my late race endurance. Okay, we get that. It could be part of the problem. Dan, you alluded to the idea that unfortunately we hit the ground. Faster we go, the harder we hit. Well, if you're not strong enough to absorb that hit, or the muscles do not possess enough of a range of motion, it's generically known as flexibility. I want our listeners to be a little bit more sophisticated. Instead of using the word flexibility, think about joint mobility. So, for example, if my bicep is extremely tight, it's always going to have my arm shortened. Well, if velocity, let's say I fall off the motorcycle and I'm literally ragdolling down the track, the velocity of my arm getting thrown straight out in front of me is actually going to rip the head of the bicep, either at the origin or the insertion. So, Dan, when we look at flexibility, if I can get the listeners to think more about joint mobility, bicep and tricep drives your mobility of your elbow. Hamstring to quadriceps, mobility within the kneecap. What's above and below your ankle, your feet, your calves, the front of your shins, tibialis anterior, that's what's going to give you that ankle mobility. Dan, you ride moto. How important is ankle flexibility? How important is hinging the hips? How important is it to be able to bend your knees and ride with your toes inward for those of you that ride moto? But again, we can apply this to cycling. We can apply this to running, swimming, tennis, soccer, any sport that you're in. We are going to just make an assumption. And I know everybody thinks they can be in better shape. We're talking tonight that let's just stamp your fitness where it's at. You go out and you, Dan, you have the flexibility, the strength, you have the appropriate speed, and you have the appropriate endurance. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So now what we want to say is the second pillar of fitness, you've already got that dialed. And this is where I want everybody, especially if you're watching this on YouTube and you can look at the visual illustration, look at pillar number 1. If you get up, let's say, Dan, let's say you and your bride go to dinner tonight and you get finished with dinner at 7 o'clock at night. You get up tomorrow morning. Again, I'll use moto because that's what your sport of choice is.
Mm-hmm.
You get up, you drive 2 hours to Zeb's track. You get to the track, you get signed in, you get a couple rounds of practice, you get a couple races in. It's 12 o'clock noon. You go, man, my stomach's starting to get a little hollow. Well, you just came off the track and you're talking with our buddy James, and you're saying to him, man, I don't know why, I just feel flat today. Remember, most people, if they haven't watched or listened to this podcast, they're immediately going to go into fitness. Oh, Dan, the reason why you're inconsistent, the reason why you're throwing anchor is you got to improve your endurance. You got to improve some level of fitness. Could be an issue, of course, but stop and think about what we just said, Dan. You got finished with dinner at 7 o'clock at night. It's now 12 o'clock the next day. Think about the math on that. So you're sitting there 17 hours after your last meal. What do you think your blood sugar levels are like? They're depleted. What is your hydration level? Probably depleted. And Dan, you have a little one at home. What if she went to some function last night and you got home a little bit later than usual, and you still have to get up in time to do that 2-hour drive, to get unloaded, get geared up, get registered. So you're still leaving the house at 6 a.m. Well, now you're coming into that day of riding or racing. You're tired. If everybody could please take a look at this pillar in this illustration. Now you're coming in, you're tired. You haven't eaten in 17 hours, and you're probably slightly dehydrated. Now, is that a fitness issue or is that a preparation issue? That's why I think it's so important, because Dan, you've done an excellent job of nailing this second pillar, and probably most of our listeners have done the same thing. The challenge is, and this is where the Garmin comes in. When we look at being properly fed, Dan, all we've got to do is go to the Garmin platform, look at the calories burned, go to MyFitnessPal, calories consumed. How much are you tightening up that gap? We know how to validate whether or not you're hydrated or not. Weigh yourself in the morning, weigh yourself at night. If you went to bed last night and you're 3 to 5 pounds heavier than you were in the morning, you're hydrated. Good job. And then obviously we just teased about the fact that maybe you didn't get your typical 9 hours of sleep. You only got 6 or 7. Well, that's the hard part, because it's not like you're going to tell your daughter, hey, I can't pick you up from that function because I got to get to bed early so I can go ride. You do a great job of being your daughter's dad, And you're like, yeah, that's part of being a dad, right? Because I think it's very important that the listeners understand that you and I don't live in a glass house, and we know our listeners don't either. So let's talk in real world terms always.
Yeah. And like I said, one of the things at the beginning of the show, I said it's basic stuff that we tend to forget about, right? And for
Yes.
me, it's eating in the morning
Hmm.
before I go to the track. Like you said, get up early, get prepared, drive over to the track. Like I, you know how mornings are,
Yep.
Coach.
Yep.
I'm not a morning person for one, so for me to get up and like make eggs and and bacon and something to eat, that's just it's just not me. I
Yeah.
don't know what to say, but I've noticed that when I don't just take the 10 minutes to make some scrambled eggs, throw them in a tortilla or whatever, and grab a little bite to eat before I leave the house, if I don't do that, I feel terrible
Yeah.
around 12, 1 o'clock.
Yep.
Because if I'm not eating in the morning, Coach, do you think I'm actually taking like packing snacks and stuff to the track?
No.
Of course not.
No.
So
Well, and
something
you just
so
peeled back
basic.
the onion. Pardon my interruption, but you just peeled back a part of the onion that I want to make sure our listeners don't miss. If we look at this illustration, you've dialed in pillar number 2, and with your commitment to going to the gym and you've adjusted your eating and all, this is where the preparation can actually bite you in the butt even harder because you're leaner and stronger. For those of you that work and live in the motor world, right? As we mod a motor, as we beef up a motor, car motor, truck motor, motorcycle, whatever it is, think about all the surrounding pieces and parts that we have to beef up to embrace that modded motor. So the good news is you're leaner, stronger, and faster. The bad news is you're leaner, stronger, and faster. So, Dan, if you elaborate on what you just said, now when you skip breakfast, it hurts you more now than when you weren't as in good a shape. Think about how that becomes a real bite in the butt. Now, we don't want to be Debbie Downer. All we're trying to do in this webinar together is get people to understand, why am I falling off pace? It could be fitness, but it isn't always fitness. And then when you do get your fitness, and this is where, again, we get into that very sensitive subject of mental confidence. You have somebody who's been really dedicated for 6, 8, 12 months, and they still keep getting abysmal results at the track in training or racing. And they're like, what in the world is going on? And we're, especially if you're listening to this webinar, this podcast, you're very dedicated. You're probably hyper competitive. So what happens, Dan, when you get beat by somebody on Saturday? You go to the gym on Monday and train harder. It's not a fitness issue, but you haven't, you have yet to identify, well, what actually is it? And that's why I wanted to do this podcast. Let's step back and look at all 4 pillars, because all 4 pillars contribute to success. It's, as the old saying goes, I know it's a cliche, we are only as strong as our weakest link. Well, our goal is in this podcast together is to try to find what it is. So, Dan, come back to what you just said. When you're looking at being properly fed, and this is another mistake that people have a tendency to overlook or maybe just not aware of it. Dan, you mentioned you're not a morning person. So the last thing we want to do is have you choke down 600, 700 calories of food when you're not a morning person in the morning. Because number one, it's going to literally make you sick to your stomach. Number two, you're going to take it out on everybody else around you. And number three, you're not setting yourself up for a good day of riding or racing. So do you see how eating breakfast, even though we know we're going to need it when we are actually training and racing, can be counterproductive, because all you've done is you've just set the wrong tone for the entire day. Now, again, we don't live in a glass house, but if you go to the track and you haven't eaten in 17 hours, you know that's going to have a pretty poor end result. But then we also know that if you go and try to choke down 600 calories before 7 o'clock in the morning, and Dan, as you say, don't even talk to me before 9 a.m. I'm not very cordial, right?
Yep.
You're owning it. So now we get back to, is that a fitness issue or is that a preparation issue? That preparation issue has to factor in who you are as an individual. Dan, we've talked to all of our listeners about this before. Think about that textbook test. I can say to you, hey, Mr. Colvin, it's very important that you get at least 600 calories in you before you get to the track. We haven't discussed what time that's going to be. We haven't discussed what you've got to do before you get to the track. It's really easy for me to pull out a textbook and hit you over the wrist with it and say, Mr. Colvin, you must get this calories in come heck or high water. Nope, it's not going to work. you're literally trying to pound a square peg into a round hole. That's where I hope this starts to put a smile on our listeners' faces. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. You might not be actually understanding what's wrong, and it's not always about fitness. So hopefully we've done a good job of getting people to understand this preparation phase. Now, Dan, what is it that we're speaking about tonight? You come off the track, you're talking to our buddy James, and you say, hey, James, I don't know why, man, but I just threw anchor out there. Well, you mentioned that you finally came to you came off the dark side and you're now on the bright side. Okay, you've got a Garmin platform now. What we're able to do is when the race is over or the ride session is over, what is it that you and I have done when you're at the track? You call me up, you're like, hey man, can you log in? I need you to look at something. You sync your phone, update the server, I dial in, we look at average heart rate, we look at max heart rate. I say to you, Dan, how much did you sweat during that moto? You stepped on the scale dry before you rode, you stepped on the scale when you're dry and out of your wet gear. We figured out your sweat rate. And the reason why I want to introduce this third pillar in that format is if your heart rate, and again, I'm going to use very, very generic numbers here. So please, nobody hang your hat on these numbers. Dan, you and I have already tested what your max heart rate is on the motorcycle. Well, what happens if you've got a 6-lap race and you hit that max heart rate at the end of lap number 1? Because you're pissed off that somebody keeps dropping you early in the race. So you just lay wood and you go after them super aggressively. And you literally hit your maximum heart rate at lap 1 of a 6-lap race. Are you going to go any faster for the next 5 laps?
Nope. You're going to throw anchor.
And I don't think there's a listener out here, no matter what how or where you consider yourself on the athletic realm of things, if you hit your anaerobic threshold, if you hit your maximum heart rate and you have anything more than about 12 seconds left, you're going to go backwards because it's a non-sustainable effort. That's why
I have a question. I have a
Yep.
question real quick. Sorry to derail you.
No, you're not. I just want to make sure people understand when we say heart rate intensity, we're going to make a small assumption that you know what that max heart rate number is, because when we're looking at your number, we don't know, what are we comparing it to? Go ahead, boss.
You mentioned, like when your heart rate spikes, right? And like when your heart rate spikes and you get that adrenaline feel, like
Yes.
whether it's going balls out, trying to catch somebody, or more times than not, you've had a sketchy moment where you've almost crashed, right?
Yeah.
And your heartbeat spikes and you get that adrenaline rush.
Yep.
Is that what that is? Is it adrenaline essentially?
Yes. No pun intended. That's where your fight or flight response from the body comes in. When you feel like, no disrespect to any females who are listening, but you get that full butt pucker, whether you nose pick something or you're going to case something really hard on the motocross track. Yeah, that is literally an adrenaline. It's actually cortisol and adrenaline getting dropped into the system, because cortisol is a byproduct of the fight or flight. And because we're already getting these big endorphin releases and you've already got all these hormones floating around in your system, I wouldn't say it's just one or the other. It's just going to be kind of the perfect melting pot of all kinds of hormones, predominantly adrenaline and cortisol. Absolutely.
And then that's what causes your heart rate to spike, correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Got it.
Now, there's other complicated problems with that. Now, if I get too complicated, Dan, you've always been good about getting me back out of the weeds. For those of you who don't ride moto, just imagine Dan riding his motorcycle, jumping big jumps, and you come up short, which means you land right on top of the second one and it hurts. And a lot of people think, oh, you've got suspension, it can't be that bad. No, it hurts. Well, and I'm not telling you, Dan, anything that you don't already know, nor our listeners, but once you case that jump, it's pretty safe to assume that it's going to take you a little bit of time. The more experienced you are, the quicker you can get it behind you and kind of resume your normal flow pattern. But what happens when we case the jump? We have a tendency to be off balance in the next corner. We probably miss a gear down the next straightaway. We just start to create a cascade of mistake on top of mistake on top of mistake on top of mistake. And unfortunately, this is where I'm getting into the weeds, but hopefully it'll make sense. Every time you case the next jump, the next time you get cross-rutted, the next time something goes wrong, that just puts more load on the human body. Because face it, when you butter the backside of the jump, you put very little load on your quadriceps. But when you case or come up ever so slightly short and that suspension compresses, well, that energy's got to go up your legs. And then Your legs are the largest consumer of oxygen from your hips all the way to your kneecaps. So put those two together. Short land, very taxing on the body, not to mention the fear. So you've got a bunch of hormones floating around. You just put the muscles through an incredible amount of load. And because your rhythm is off, everything else just becomes rougher and rougher, which makes it physically more demanding to be able to go fast. So the heart rate gets compounded with adrenaline and cortisol. Do you see how that's a perfect storm?
Yep.
For those of you who are runners, the best way I can explain it to you is, and we've done this numerous times, if we film our top runners at mile 3, at mile 6, at mile 12, at mile 20, mile 26, and you lay the video over, their biomechanics are exactly the same. That's what makes an elite athlete so special, is even though physically they might be breaking down, they do a phenomenal job of being able to hold those biomechanics together, which allows them to run very, very efficiently. Well, as you lose your efficiency, it ends up becoming physical. We have a mantra in the physiology world. The body will always prefer the path of least resistance, which unfortunately is biomechanically atrocious. So as you fatigue, primary movers fatigue, whether you're running, riding a motorcycle, a bicycle, whatever, when the primary movers fatigue, if the secondary aren't strong enough to step up, your biomechanics as a runner go backwards, shoulders go back, hips tuck underneath you, and now you're landing on your heel instead of landing in the midfoot, you're landing on your heel, and this is a knee break. So now you're tired, biomechanics go south, your bioefficiency goes down the pooper. You just become, because your biomechanics are falling apart, it becomes harder and harder to keep the pace up. That's why we always say, and I know it's easier said than done, whenever you feel like you're falling apart, go faster. Because what it does is it corrects the biomechanics. I know it sounds dumb. When you're on the motorcycle and you feel like you're just falling apart, surge. Because when you are forcing yourself to go faster, the body will automatically biomechanically correct. Like with a runner, we say fall forward. Instead of you landing on your heels, make yourself fall forward so you get back into landing on your midfoot. Ear is over kneecap, kneecap is over placement of foot. Now your running biomechanics come back around. Your run cadence goes back up. We could say the same thing about the bicycle. When you get tired, you start pedaling in squares instead of pedaling in circles. So we always say accelerate when you feel like you're starting to get choppy. Again, a lot easier said than done, but it does make a big difference.
It
Does that
does
make
seem
sense?
ass backwards, ain't gonna
It
lie.
does. No, exactly. Yeah, it does. It seems completely the opposite direction of what you would want to do. And that's why when we're working with all of our clients, we really emphasize the importance of being physically strong in the gym. Because most people think the gym is just about getting your primary muscles to look good on the beach, and that's nice. But what lifting does is lifting actually solicits the secondary movers. So when the primary give up, the second step up. That's how we're able to stay in good form. This is what differentiates a good athlete from an elite athlete and an elite athlete from a pro. Now, with that being said, look at where we've gone through here, Dan, and look at we've assumed, we kind of joked about it. We're just going to bypass pillar number 2. We've already talked about how preparation could be the reason why you're falling off the pace. We've talked about the idea that maybe you went out simply too hard. Maybe you went to an intensity level, and if you're taking notes, which I hope you guys always do, when you take the intensity level up, and again, I'm not trying to insult anyone's intelligence, think about what happens when you bring the speed up in any sport or any discipline, Dan. When you bring the heart rate up, you burn more calories and you increase the sweat rate. Well, if we go back, I apologize, let me go back to sharing the screen again real quick. Here you are, you're increasing your speed because you want to go faster and faster. And what it does is, and I hope this doesn't sound too rhetorical, we already talked about the idea that you came to today's practice or race session and preparation was already in disarray. And then you're out there racing at a heart rate that's a little bit higher than you're physically in shape to do. That's what makes fitness kind of bite you in the butt. But let's say that you are racing at an intensity that you know that you can maintain. Well, what it does is it puts a demand back on the preparation phase because you're out there racing at an intensity level that you know you're capable of, but You already came to today dehydrated. So now your sweat rate's going to be negatively impacted. You've already come to today with not enough calories in your system. Your brain is fed by the liver. We could refer to that as gas tank number one, and your muscles are gas tank number two. Do you see how this becomes Pandora's box of problems? You started the day ill prepared. We skip over fitness because you're fit. Your execution may have been a little bit off point. And when your execution is off point, it just takes the preparation and exposes you already started the day behind the eight ball. Now you're triply screwed, and you still have 4 more races for those that ride moto, or if you're a triathlete, you still have to get off the bike and run. You see how this puts you into a really bad position? And we're not even talking about your strength or endurance, flexibility, none of it. It's everything that benchmarks around it, bookmarks around it. Does that make sense at all?
Yep.
So let's come over here now to the recovery side. Now, I pulled this illustration because you ride moto. When you get done with race number one, and let's say you have 6 races for the day, so many people, and I know there's stuff that goes on. You got to change a tire, you got to change grips, you decide that you're going to change your gearing, you decide to change whatever, right? It's very easy to get distracted between races. But when you come off that racetrack, Dan, you've started a stopwatch, and your recovery for moto number 2 starts as soon as you come off the track. For those of you that are in a running race, I'll use a marathon, a big example. We always say that the race doesn't begin until mile 20. So if you don't get to mile 20 relatively fresh, there's no way you're going to finish that last 10K with any kind of, we always say we want you to finish stronger than you started. How can you go faster the last 10K if you're already a pile of rubble at mile 20? Do you see the dichotomy here? So what we see a lot of times is people don't look at in between motos or in between sessions. Let's say you're a runner and you're doing speed work. If you're not recovering correctly hour by hour, and then notice bullet point number 2, day by day. Well, unfortunately, if you screw up recovery on Monday, that negatively impacts Tuesday. Now, Dan, step back and think about what we've spent 45 minutes talking about. If you come into today ill prepared, then you go out and you execute in the wrong manner, i.e., wrong intensity, it only exposes the preparation flaw, and then you screw up the recovery. Well, now you came into Monday messed up, you screwed up Monday on execution and recovery. Well, then that stockpiles and goes into Tuesday. So for those of you that do multi-day events, moto, any other type of athletic event, like a decathlon, it's not about how well you perform on day one as much as it is you got to be the best performer on the last day of the week. Well, look at this column right here, recovery, hour by hour, day by day, training week over training week. Dan, you and I have worked together for quite a while now. You know we do everything in 6 and 8 week blocks. Well, if you didn't recover from phase 1, what do you think the stage is set for phase number 2? Better or worse?
Worse.
And yet people go, I got to get fitter. Maybe, but my experience has been it's probably not as much as you think. And then when we look at training block to training block, preseason to pre-competitive, competitive phase 1 to competitive phase 2, now stop and look at these 4 pillars. When people come to me and they say, Rob, I've got to get fitter. Yeah, I totally get it. But ironically, I spend a lion's share of the first couple of weeks getting to know the athlete. How's your preparation? And now, Dan, these pillars become dominoes, because when you're properly prepared and you go work out, you'll get fitter. And when you're prepared and you're fit, you start to learn a little bit more about how to execute at the right intensity for the duration. And then when you get these 3 pillars and you see the importance of recovery, now I come back to Monday morning, I'm better prepared for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, January, March, June. Now, not only am I in better shape, I started to answer the question as to why am I falling off? And it's really fascinating because, as we teased about earlier, Dan, you're getting much leaner. Your muscle mass has gone up substantially. Well, now that your muscle mass has gone up, the number of calories that you burn on a daily basis has gone up. So let's go back to this real quick, just literally for 60 seconds. This is where we go back to that original block or that original illustration. Man, Dan, I'm so excited for you. Athletically, you're 1% leaner, stronger, and faster. Bank accounts getting bigger. You're loving your new job. You and your bride are doing fantastic. Everything's going great. Well, I love the fact that this box has gotten 1% bigger. We've got to know how much to improve, or rather increase, both food and sleep to offset that 1% improvement on the personal side of things. And when I say personal, I'm saying I should rephrase that. You've got to offset the stress box on the left because it's gotten bigger. Well, you've got to offset it with more food and sleep. And Dan, I've talked a lot about this both on and off the show. How difficult is it for you to get 3,000 calories in per day when you eat fruits, vegetables, and lean protein?
It's tough.
Full-time job.
It's tough. Yep.
Now think about this vicious cycle that we've just spoke about on our podcast tonight, right? People want to be leaner, they want to be stronger, and they want to be faster. And then they do, and it puts a bigger demand on their sweat rate, which means your hydration intake, puts a higher demand on your calorie intake because you have a higher overall calorie burn rate. And then because you're out there going faster, it puts a bigger demand on how much sleep you need. Think about when your daughter goes through a growth spurt. Notice how she sleeps so much more.
Yep.
And yet we become adults and we're like, yes, my strength to weight ratios are up. My VO2 max is up. My max heart rate's gotten better. My resting heart rate's lower. Yay, Dan, I'm fitter. Everybody's excited. High five, knuckle punch. And then they forget they've got to eat more, they've got to sleep more, and they have to drink more. They have to have a better idea of how their strategy in training and racing has to be adjusted. And it puts a bigger demand on recovery because, again, good news is you're leaner, stronger, and faster. Bad news is you're leaner, stronger, and faster. So the responsibility of that fourth pillar, recovery, it becomes a game changer. You'll have people that'll dial 3 of the 4. You can choose any of those, right? The old days when you do the cup game, like where's the
Yep.
where's the quarter under the cup, right? All it takes is one of those 4 pillars or one of those attributes in it. And it's not as hard as, that's why I appreciate everybody's patience. It's never as hard as a lot of the talking pundits like to make it out to be. That's why we like the Garmin. It takes the lion's share of the information and it gathers, and then we can make executive decisions. Hey, Dan, how many calories should you take in? Let's look at what your burn rate is,
Yep.
both to stay alive as well as when you cross train.
And
Hey,
you'll think
you
too,
say?
like going back to eating fruits and vegetables and lean protein,
Yeah,
when you're on that regimen, right? People will say, like I've heard it, man, you eat too much. Like,
yeah,
because I'm always snacking. But if you add up the calories in the day, it's not a lot. It's in fact sometimes you're shy, right?
yeah.
It's much harder to get your calories in that way versus, going to McDonald's, of course, but
Yep.
that's easy. But
Well, tonight's been a lot of dichotomies and endless loops. And I think you just brought probably the most frustrating one for anybody who has struggled with dropping body fat because of what you just said. Nobody gets fat by eating fruits, vegetables, and lean protein. It's never been possible. It's never been achieved by anybody in mankind, with one caveat. If you know what your burn rate is, try to stay pretty close to that. I'm not going to get into should you overeat, undereat, when. I'm not into intermittent fasting. I'm not into all kinds of reasons. I'm not into those things for a multitude of reasons. Maybe we can do that on the next show. But to your point, Dan, if I've grown up, I was a very fat kid up until 7th grade. You would call me morbidly obese.
really,
Okay. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. I was morbidly obese. I wouldn't say morbidly obese. Like my health wasn't but I looked like a roly poly. And it was my 8th grade. I was going into 8th grade, and the gentleman who was running our when kids had PE, we actually had physical education in school. He put a note out and he said, I'm going to open the school gym every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 6 a.m. And I just, something clicked in my head, and I asked my dad, and I said, hey, Dad, can I go to that? And he said, yeah, you get yourself up, you walk yourself. We lived about a mile and a half from school, but of course you're walking in the dark. And when you're in 7th grade, there's boogeymans and big bats everywhere. And that's when Friday the 13th had just come out. So it was even worse to be in a field at night. But my dad said, sure, if you want to do it. And I did. And his name's Mr. Randy Lauders. I'm forever indebted to him because he taught me how to lift. And isn't it ironic that my entire career is around physical fitness? And the long and the short of all that is I was a short, fat little kid. And so now imagine maybe one of our listeners is a middle-aged adult and they've been told their whole life that you're orally fixated. Dan, you just said it. You eat too much. You never stop eating, blah, blah, blah. And then they come to our program And what I'm trying to do behind the scenes is I'm trying to have them eat. Let's get kind of technical for a second. Essentially, I'm trying to get you to eat a low glycemic diet. That means you get less of an insulin spike from your pancreas, and we're trying to keep your sugar highs and lows more stabilized. That's why we graze every couple hours. But what we just spent an hour talking about is, well, what happens when Dan goes out and rides and his total calorie burns for the day is 5,000 calories? Going back to your point, Dan, fruits, vegetables, and lean protein are not calorie dense, but they're very nutrient dense. So the nutrient density keeps our immune system up, keeps our hair from falling out, keeps our skin from becoming brittle, keeps us from getting dark circles under our eyes, right? The problem that you run into is it's not calorically dense enough. So now you find yourself, I always use, and I want everybody to do this. If you have a heart rate monitor and you know what your calorie burn rate is, I want you to take your total calorie burn rate for the day and divide it by 75. An extra large egg has approximately 75 calories. And Dan, this is always a great illustration because if you get somebody that burns 33 to 3,500 calories and you're like, hey, look, you've got to eat 45 to 49 extra large eggs, and you visualize 4 dozen eggs on the counter in the morning. And let's say tomorrow is going to absolutely emulate minute by minute what you and I did today. So we look at our calorie burn rate and we go, okay, tomorrow I'm going to burn 50 extra large eggs. And I lay that up in the counter and I say, Dan, from the moment your feet get on the floor in the morning until your head hits your pillow, you have to consume those 50 extra large eggs. When you start to put quantity of food against calorie expenditure versus calorie intake, it's a huge aha moment for most people
Yeah.
because of what you just said. Man, Dan, you're always eating. Well, shit, I've got to take in 5,000 calories. Now, for somebody who's struggling with weight loss and stuff like that, I'm still not a big fan of a huge calorie gap. A couple hundred calories here or there, that's okay. And the reason why I want to emphasize that is think about it. If we put the body under an undue amount of stress, you need 5,000 calories and you're taking in 3,000, that's going to drive up your cortisol levels because now that lack of calories becomes a stress. Just like exercise, you should not be exercising to the point that you start to loathe it. And unfortunately, a lot of people do that, especially
Yeah.
with these so-called, I call them weekend certificate trainers, you know, and they're like, I'm going to make this miserable. You're going to remember this workout for a month, right? And I'm like, well, is it about you or is it about the client? And I don't coddle my clients. I do speak very bluntly, but again, I'm only trying to help people get the Cliff Note version of nutrition and physiology to get their desirable results. Just taking and grinding somebody down, what's that do? Feed my ego? It's not getting you where you want to be because when the heart rate's extremely high, you're burning stored sugar and not stored fat. And if you came to me in our weight loss division saying you want to drop body fat, why in God's green earth do I have you doing high intensity interval training, HIIT training that everybody likes to refer to?
It's
Oh,
because you get the instant, I don't know what the correct word is. You're sweating,
yeah.
you're tired, you're getting the effects of a hard workout,
Hmm.
but that's what you're getting. It may not have been a good workout. It may not
Well,
have
I
been
like,
good or healthy for you, but everybody's telling you, "Oh man, you grinded today because you're drenched in sweat," you
yep.
know?
Well, I like the fact that you use the word hard because I don't think that the workout has to be hard to be productive. Now, don't get me wrong, with our elite athletes and we're doing lactate threshold and anaerobic threshold, there's a time and a place. But here's where I want every listener to change their perspective by 1 degree. Please do not put yourself through a hard, long workout. Notice I said those separately. It could be a long workout, those are hard, or short and fast and intense, those are hard. Please don't go and do those until you can go and look at your biofeedback indicators and know that you fully recovered enough from yesterday, last week, last month, last year. If you stack fatigue on top of fatigue on top of fatigue on top of fatigue, you get sick, you get injured, and if you do that long enough, you end up with adrenal fatigue, Epstein-Barr, or Addison's disease. A hormonally adrenal, literally, your adrenal system is officially baked. Whatever title you want to give it. What pisses me off to no end is all fatigue related diseases are avoidable. That's what makes me so angry. I have no problems encouraging my athletes to do difficult workouts when the body shows it's ready for it. The intensity and the duration is relevant to the individual and what they're training for. And if you keep stacking those on top of each other, you as an athlete will do nothing but go upward and onward. But
Yep.
if I'm going to walk in and be screaming and hollering and call you names and, I'm like, come on, dude, get over yourself. What did Dan come to me for? First, it was fill in the blank. Maybe this time of the year, you want to qualify for World Vets. Well, it's got a certain set of characteristics that we need to be ready for.
Yep.
What if it's a different time of the year and you just want to lose 4 pounds? Maybe it's you and your bride are going on a cruise. Everybody's needs, wants, and desires change. Well, how do you get there in a healthy format? Sure, I can make you lose 10 pounds in a week. It's just called dehydration. If you want to pay me $1,000 for that, great. I'll park you in a car in a parking lot and let you sweat it out. Pay me $1,000. That's not healthy. And you're not educating somebody on how does body fat actually fall off the body? How does lean muscle build? How do you sustain both, less fat, more muscle, and do it in a healthy, sustainable way? That's
Well,
why I
and
appreciate the listeners getting educated. Pardon me.
being dehydrated, losing weight, being dehydrated is not a permanent fix,
No, it's not.
and
And
that's the problem.
if I may elaborate on what you just said, we started tonight's conversation about the idea that, hey, why am I falling off the pace? Please listen. If you've stuck with us this far, this is the best nugget of the night. If you're more than 2% dehydrated, so on a 100-pound person, you're only talking 2 pounds. If you're more than 2% dehydrated, notice I use the word dehydrated, Dan, that you just mentioned, your speed and your endurance will 100% be negatively affected. So when we go to those 4 pillars, right, someone's getting dropped, they're falling off the pace, and they're just simply dehydrated for whatever reason, whether it's because you sweat excessively or you just didn't drink enough fluids. And remember, a lot of your hydration comes from snacking on nutrient dense fruits and vegetables, which are also high in water. You see how everything we talk about has its own self correcting mechanism? If somebody says to you, Dan, are you eating a low glycemic diet? You could say yes. Now, most people don't know what low glycemic is, but if you're educated in that and you're like, you need to have a low glycemic diet, you literally can check the box because you eat fruits, vegetables, and lean protein. It's a low glycemic diet. Oh, but Dan, you've got to be careful of that alkalinity and pH level in your blood because if you have a high alkalinity level, you're a precursor to cancer. Guess what? When you eat fruits, vegetables, and lean protein, the pH and alkalinity in the blood dialed. You're literally where you're supposed to be. Isn't that interesting how it takes care of itself?
Mm-hmm.
But Dan, you're electrolyte depleted. Well, if you're snacking on fruits, vegetables, and you know what your sweat rate is, and you're consuming enough water during the day, check. And literally, no matter what somebody wants to come up and tell you, because unfortunately with the internet, people like to create a lot of
Oh
fear,
yeah.
a lot of fear mongers. No matter what they come out and say to you, if you eat fruits, vegetables, and lean protein, if you consume half your body weight in ounces of water, so if you weigh 200 pounds, you need to consume 100 ounces of water over 10 hours. So now you know how much water to consume. If you take your if you weigh yourself before and after a physical activity, you can figure out your sweat rate. So, Dan, any rebuttal that somebody comes in, like when someone says you're eating too much, well, let's talk about that. How many calories do you eat a day? Most people can't answer that question. If you can give me an answer, then I want to know what are you eating that falls into those 3 categories, fruits, vegetables, and protein, that add up to your calorie needs. That reduces the stress. Now Dan's sleeping like a baby. Let's look at your sleep score. 9 hours of sleep. You got to look at the deep sleep to the awake time. Hey, Dan, good job. You're getting almost 2 hours of deep sleep. You're 152, less than 10 minutes of awake time out of 9 hours. No wonder why you're hauling ass on the motorcycle. Checkbox, checkbox, checkbox. But remember, it's 4 pillars, not just fitness. Preparation, fitness, execution, and recovery. You keep steamrolling these days over day. That's why I say the pillars become dominoes, because now Dan's just, the dominoes are falling, the snowball's starting to accumulate, and man, get out of his way. Lead, follow, or get out of my way, because here comes Dan.
I'm gonna rename you, Coach, to Billy. Because
Billy.
you're Billy the basics, man. You just gotta
Oh,
get back to Billy basics.
I love it. Well,
It's
in as much as we joke about acronyms, right? We use the KISS acronym, keep it simple and sustainable. And people mock me on that. And for those of you that are in the moto world, if you remember when I was training with Ryan Dungey and we did that CBS special, go back and watch it. And they call me out because I asked Ryan if he ate his ice cream before bed. And he said, oh, yeah. And so I got labeled the guy who advocates ice cream. And now you know why. When somebody's burning an abundance of calories, I would, yeah, if you want to eat 17 more eggs before bed, go for it. I'm going to do a Haagen-Dazs bar. I'm
I'm
going to
gonna
choose my battles.
I'm gonna ask Dunge next time I see him if he still eats ice cream before bed.
I would love it. And please film him when you ask him, because I want to see
Yep.
that smile on his face. So, but
Coach,
no,
anything else
Dan,
before we wrap up? Why somebody might be falling off pace, but it ain't their
no,
fitness?
sir. No, sir. I
I
just
think we
hope
hit
that
it.
we've created some epiphanies for people. And, obviously if you're listening to this on a podcast, please go and watch the YouTube video. Take a snapshot with your phone of what each one of those tiles look like, commit them to memory, because I promise you, just like gravity, if I drop my pen, gravity guarantees me it's going to hit my floor. And same thing here. If you just, like I said, I'm always trying to keep it at 10,000. And Dan, thank you for keeping me out of the weeds. If people can understand more of the why and what's happening, or maybe more importantly, what's not happening, and maybe we can eliminate a lot of frustrations. And again, I'm not trying to get all fluffy, but man, I see people pull the parachute and give up because somebody said they have to do something this absolute adamant way, and it's not true. I'm only regurgitating what I've learned in the world of physiology and nutrition, but I certainly am not the creator of it, that's for sure. But we definitely have to respect it. So
Yep.
thank you for pulling me through this conversation, and I hope all of our listeners have a lot of takeaways tonight.
Yep. Thank you, Coach Robb. Thank you to all of our listeners. Make sure you guys like, subscribe, share, leave comments, send us questions. We love it. We will see you guys on the next Coach Robb Performance Podcast.
Thank you. Peace.